Relax and listen to the voice. Welcome back to Terrifying Tales. This installment is Volume 3. Make sure your doors are locked, get somewhere safe, and let's get ready to begin. Molly might not have been so angry if it hadn't been raining, but it seemed like the height of unfairness for her mother to drag her away from her favorite television program and to send her out in the rotten weather to fetch Jason home from his tea party with Mrs. Wells. Just because her little brother was too dumb to know when it was supper time and Mrs. Wells was too old-fashioned to have a telephone, Molly had to suffer. "It's not raining that hard," her mother said, handing her a slicker and a pair of rain boots. "And the fresh air will be better for you than that witch show. I don't like all this interest of yours in magic and witchcraft anyway. The first thing you know, you'll start believing all that nonsense is true." "I could believe Miss Wells is a witch," Molly said. "She's probably fattening Jason up for the kill, like in Hansel and Gretel. Why else would an old lady like that invite a 7-year-old in for chocolate and cookies?" "Now that's enough of that talk. Mrs. Wells has had a lot of tragedy in her life, and if Jason reminds her of one of her youngsters who died so long ago, there's no harm in letting him help her relive her memories. I want you to be respectful towards her." Molly yanked the plastic rain boots over her shoes. "I hardly ever even see her. She never gave me even a stick of stale gum. It's Jason who gets all the favors." "She is odd," her mother conceded, "but you have to remember that she's very old, too. She probably doesn't realize you'd care about candy and gum and comics at your age. You look pretty grown up for 12, you know." That wasn't true, and Molly knew it. She was small for her age, and had more than once been mistaken for younger than she was. Anyway, it wasn't the candy and gum and cookies that she cared about so much. It was the unfairness. She and Jason were the only children on this road. According to the real estate man, there had been no children in the neighborhood for some 20 years. So it wasn't as if Mrs. Wells had singled Jason out from among dozens to be her pet. Besides, it was Jason who got all the favors from everyone, and Molly was always expected to act her age and not care and go sloshing out in the rain on errands that nobody else wanted to do. It wasn't fair. She ran most of the short distance to Mrs. Wells's house, her head bent in against the rain and her fist clenched in her pockets. Jason let her in, acting as if he lived there. "Don't come on the carpet all wet," he told her. "Stay on the mat." Molly stuck her tongue out at him and raised her eyes in swift innocence as Mrs. Wells appeared from the kitchen. From the top shelf of the bookcase, a plump rag figure grinned down on her with a mouth of red yarn. Molly's interest was captured at once. "Is that a doll, or a monkey, or what is it?" Mrs. Wells turned. "Oh, that's Patches. He started out as an ordinary toy monkey, but he wore out so fast that I finally had to make him new skin out of pieces from the clothes of all the children who ever played with him." She lifted the creature from the shelf and brought it to Molly for examination. It really was a monkey made of patches. One paw was red, the other a pink, handy stripe, and its tail was a long tube of faded denim. Tufts of brown yarn stood out and around a face that looked like it might have once been a white stocking. The eyes above the red grin were round black buttons, and a collar of little brass bells jingled around its neck. "He's taken care of quite a few children in his time," Mrs. Wells said, smoothing a triangle of blue gingham that had formed the monkey's left shoulder. The children come and the children go, don't they, Patches? That's what keeps us young. Molly touched a flower-sprigged hind foot. What a lot of different cloth. I'd sit and look at him all day if I had him. She wasn't sure herself if she were wishing or hinting. Ugh, I wouldn't, Jason said. He slid both hands around the monkey's middle, ignoring the fact that Molly was holding it. I'd play with him. Jason, Molly protested, tightening her grip. She glanced up at Mrs. Wells for confirmation that he had been given no permission to take possession. Would you, dear? Mrs. Wells' blue-veined fingers removed the monkey from both children and held it up at a tantalizing height. She tilted her head to smile into the white stocking face, and the reflected light of the lamp shot sparks of fire from her spectacles. He'd like you, I'm sure. It would freshen him up a lot to go home with you. For one delightful moment, Molly thought Mrs. Wells was about to give the monkey to her. She put it instead into Jason's hands. I don't care, Molly told herself fiercely. She said it aloud to Jason when they got outside and Mrs. Wells's door was shut behind them. I don't care. I saw him first, and she showed him to me first, so he ought to be mine if I want him, but I don't. Yes, you do. Jason patted the bulge where the monkey was zipped inside his jacket and pranced ahead of her through a puddle. But you can't have him because she gave him to me. She's my friend. She's not a friend. She's a witch. A mean, spiteful, two-faced old witch. She hates children, but she needs fresh blood from them every once in a while to keep alive, Molly said, stretching her stride to catch up with Jason. You shut up, Jason yelled at her. You're a witch. No, I'm not, but I can tell one when I see one. Molly was inventing easily now, almost as if she were telling a story she had always known. And that monkey's not a monkey either. He's her creature that she sends out to gobble up children for her. Every patch on his body is from the clothes of a child that he has gotten rid of for her, starting with her own. Just you wait. Tonight at midnight. Jason broke into a run. You shut up, I said. I'll tell Mama and Daddy what you're saying, and you'll be sorry. You shut up. Molly ran after him. You'll be sorry when he bites you. Jason dashed into their yard and slammed the gate shut before she reached it. If he bites me, he'll bite you too, and then you'll be really sorry. But Molly wasn't sorry. She knew that by the time she got the gate unlatched and could follow him, Jason would be in the house, telling how she had spoiled his monkey for him. So what? That would not unspoil it for him, or for Mrs. Wells. She glanced back up the road to where Mrs. Wells's front windows were staring out into the dark like two unwinking yellow eyes, watching her. A queer prickle down her spine sent her hurrying indoors. Jason was already eating his supper, and Molly's was waiting on the table. She had forgotten that their parents were going out this evening, and that she and Jason were going to be alone for a few hours. And I want no more talk of witches and evil spells while Daddy and I are gone. Understand? Her mother said, stopping Molly as she was about to sit down. You'll be scaring yourselves to the point where you don't know what's real and what isn't, and anything can happen after that. Again, Molly felt her skin prickle under her shirt. For a second, she almost wished her parents were going out another night, and not this one. How could her mother be so certain what was real and what wasn't? Molly had given witches scarcely a thought until she moved here, where she passed Mrs. Wells's house every day on the way to and from school. But now they were on her mind all the time. Maybe Mrs. Wells actually was some sort of evil creature sending out vibrations for Molly to pick up. Molly thought about that while she ate, and decided not to think of it any more until her parents were home again. It was not that she was scared exactly. She didn't think Jason was very scared either, the way he danced around the living room in his yellow pajamas, waving the patchwork monkey at her after their parents left, chanting, "Nya, he's mine." "So take him to bed with you and be quiet," Molly said when he had to pause for breath. "Nobody's gonna fight you for him. He's too ugly." And the monkey truly was ugly. She was surprised that she hadn't noticed it before. The red yarn mouth was so long and so thin that it looked as much like a snarl as a smile, and the unblinking button eyes seemed to stare right at you no matter where you were in the room. "I will take him to bed with me," Jason said, "if I go, but I'm not going, not until you do." He could be stubborn when he wanted to be. Molly chased him into his bedroom 5 times before she finally got him to scramble under the covers and stay there. She waited outside his door for a while, ready to catch him if he tried getting up again. When all had been quiet for about 10 minutes, she peeked inside. The light from the hall showed him sound asleep, his cheek nestled in the pillow, and the old monkey tucked under his chin. Molly admitted to herself that he was a cute little boy when he was asleep, and she could understand why an old lady like Mrs. Wells could like giving him things. But that didn't give Mrs. Wells any excuse for taking him over as if he were her own, and it was no excuse for being so unfair. Molly tiptoed downstairs. She was on the bottom step when Jason yelled. Her anger at him came back in a flood. She spun around on the step and shouted up at him, "You shut your mouth, Jason, and go to sleep this instant!" "He bit me!" Jason shouted back. His voice quivered as if he were about to cry. "He bit me, Molly!" Molly ran upstairs and switched on his bedroom light. "Who bit you? You were having a dream." "He did. The monkey." Jason, sitting on the edge of the bed, fingered his neck. He opened up the yellow collar of his pajamas to let her see a bright spot of blood on his throat. "That monkey couldn't bite you. Don't be silly," Molly said. "I made that stuff up. That's not a bite anyway. It looks more like a scratch." She picked up the monkey from the pillow. Funny, he was heavier than she had thought. A little bigger, too. She held him by his stiff, overstuffed arms and felt something scratch her thumb. There, in the end of each paw, almost hidden in the seam, was a pin bent like a hook. Some child of years ago must have thought monkeys should have claws and provided this one with them. "You probably rolled on him in your sleep and got stabbed by this pin," she said, showing the pins to Jason. "Lie down again and forget about it. You'll live, I promise." "No!" Jason said as she started to return the monkey to its place on the pillow. "I don't want him in bed anymore. Put him on the dresser." Molly couldn't blame him. Her own heart was thumping faster than was comfortable, although that was mainly because she had sped upstairs in such a hurry. She sat the monkey down hard on the dresser so that the blue denim tail pointed up against the wall. "Ugly thing," she thought. There was a faint jingle from the bells around the monkey's neck as if in answer, and for just the flicker of an eyelid, the button eyes seemed to reflect the light with a yellow gleam. "I don't want to stay up here," Jason said. "I want to come down and watch television for a while." Molly considered this. She would be in trouble if he let it slip tomorrow that she allowed him to stay up late to watch television. Still, If she made him stay up here and he scared himself sick because of her stories, she would be in worse trouble. "Okay," she said. She left him curled up in their father's armchair in the living room and went into the kitchen to heat some water for instant cocoa. Maybe that would soothe him enough to send him back to bed. When she returned to the living room, a marshmallow-topped mug in each hand, she stumbled over something in the doorway. "Well, that's a dumb place to leave anything," she said as hot cocoa sloshed over her fingers. "Why'd you bring that thing down anyway? I thought you didn't like him." She gave the patchwork monkey a kick into the middle of the room. It landed sitting up, facing her. Jason huddled himself deeper into the corner of the chair. "I didn't bring him." "Well, I didn't bring him, so how else did he get here?" A little more cocoa spilled as Molly set the dripping mugs in a pair of glass ashtrays. She drew a long breath and added very firmly, "He certainly didn't come by himself." Jason stared at her from wide, dark eyes. "I didn't bring him." Molly stood quite still. The monkey had drooped forward so that its front paws touched the floor between sprawled hind legs. It looked as if it were gathering itself for a clumsy leap. A gust of rain spattered against the windows. The drizzle that had been falling all day was growing into a real storm. "Maybe he did come by himself," Jason whispered. So that was it. Molly suddenly understood. Jason was trying to get even with her for scaring him. He was out to scare her. "If you're going to be that silly, I'm shutting him in the hall closet where he can't get out. I'd shut Mrs. Wells in there too if she was here." Molly stalked over to the monkey, grabbed it by its arms, and marched into the hall. A pain jabbed her fingers. She knew instantly that it was from the imitation claws, but it felt like tiny fangs sinking in. It felt, too, as if the monkey were wriggling in her grip, trying to get free. But that, of course, was only the effect of its heavy body swinging from its captive arms. The thing must be stuffed with lead. She needed both hands to thrust it up on the shelf in the closet. There! She slammed the door and heard the latch snap into place. Then she switched on the hall light and another light inside the living room door and a third one on the other side of the room. Not a shadow was left lurking anywhere. Then she twisted the television dial to a channel that filled the screen with dancers in beautiful gowns. Happy party music lilted from the speaker. "Drink your cocoa," she told Jason. "I don't want it." Jason was eyeing her fingers. There were streaks of blood on them. "He bit you too, didn't he?" Molly put her hand to her mouth. The punctures were beginning to hurt. "Scratched, not bit. That's a dumb toy to give anybody. It doesn't even have to be alive to kill you." "But what if it is?" Jason asked. "Is what?" A flash of lightning beyond the windows dimmed the lights for an instant. "Is alive." Jason gave a strange giggle. He was rubbing the scratch on his neck again. "What if everything you said is really true?" "That's crazy, and you're crazy to believe it." Molly wished she had closed the drapes, but she didn't feel, somehow, like walking to the end of the room to do it. "The monkey belonged to Mrs. Wells's own children. She wouldn't give an evil thing to her own children." "Those weren't her own children. She was their stepmother, and they didn't like each other when she first came to their house," Jason said. "She told me so." And all those children had died as children. How they had died, no one remembered anymore. It had happened such a long time ago. Molly had heard Mrs. Stark, the organist at church, telling her mother the old story just yesterday. One child had died from falling downstairs in a fit, Mrs. Stark thought. But nobody was still living who really knew, except Mrs. Wells, and she seemed to go on from generation to generation, never growing any older or getting any younger. Were the patches on the monkey from those stepchildren's clothes? Their clothes and no others? Anyway, Molly said a little too loudly, the monkey's shut away. He can't... A roll of thunder stopped her. It started as a rumble that grew and grew until the house trembled. In the midst of it, there was a click in the hall. Molly's neck muscles went stiff. She couldn't turn her head to look, but she didn't have to. She knew that the closet door had jarred open. "It's true," Jason whispered into the silence that followed the thunder. "True what you said." "No!" Molly cried. "Don't believe it! Don't!" But they both heard the thud of something falling, or jumping, to the floor from the closet shelf. They both heard the jingle of brass bells. Molly shot a glance at the living room door. It was still empty. "Run," she said, and she hurled herself toward the opening just as the lights flickered and went out. Something bumped into her and knocked her down. "Jason!" she yelled. "Molly! Molly! Help!" He was behind her somewhere, lost in the dark. There were scuffling noises and a crash. He kept crying to her, but his voice seemed to come from first one direction and then another. Molly was lost too. A wall met her reaching hand where the doorway should have been. She turned to the right and stumbled against the armchair. Jason was no longer in it. The chair arm and the cushions were warm with a sticky wetness. In the corner of the chair, her fingers slid across a glass ashtray like the one she had set the cocoa mugs in. "Jason," she called, "where are you?" This time, there was no answer. No sound anywhere except the lashing of rain against the window. A flare of lightning then showed her the living room doorway. She ran for it and into the blackness of the hall. The edge of the closet door struck her head full force as though someone had pushed it open. She went down in a heap onto the floor. When her spinning wits cleared and she could bear to lift her aching head, all the lights were on again. A woman on television was talking cheerily about toilet bowl cleaners. Neither Jason nor the Patchwork monkey were anywhere to be seen. "Jason?" she tried waveringly. "Up here, in my room." The voice was muffled a bit, but it was Jason's, sure enough, and he wasn't crying. He came out of his bedroom fully dressed as Molly gained the top of the stairs. His eyes were round and black in a very white face, but he was smiling. "Where are your pajamas?" she asked. He ducked his head, avoiding her eyes as he tucked his shin inside his faded denim blue jeans. "I changed them. They got messed up." His rumpled hair stood up like tufts of brown yarn. The shirt he had on was the patchwork one their grandmother had given him for his birthday. Molly hadn't ever noticed before that one of the patches was a triangle of blue gingham on the left shoulder, or that at the throat there was a square of yellow, the exact same shade as Jason's pajamas. "What happened to you? How did you get up here?" She was groping behind her for the stair rail, but she couldn't find it. "Don't you know?" Jason stretched out a hand, still half covered in a pink candy-striped cuff. "Come on, I'll show you." "No, no." Molly raised her arm to ward him off. "Stay there. Stop it. Stop fooling around." He started toward her, his smile growing wider and thinner until it was a red line of yarn across his flat face. He laughed in a silly falsetto that wasn't Jason's laugh at all.
"I'm not fooling,"
the monkey said. Molly shrank away from the blazing yellow of his eyes. The bells around his neck jingled as he moved closer. "No!" she cried once more. "I don't believe in you. You're not real." And she stepped backwards off the stair-step into space. There was an old woman who was homeless. Every night she slept in an alley, and every day she wandered around the city, rooting through garbage cans, looking for something to eat. She had never taken care of her teeth, and they all fell out many years ago. Every time she ate something, she had to mush up the food with her gums. One night, as she was doing her rounds, searching through garbage cans, she spotted something lying in the middle of an alley. She stooped down to take a closer look. Sitting in a puddle of blood, there was a pair of false teeth. Unable to believe her luck, she picked up the false teeth and wiped them off with an old rag. After looking them over, she stuck them in her mouth and tried them out. Somehow, they were a perfect fit. She wanted to test them out, so she took a soggy tomato out of a garbage can and bit into it. The false teeth worked perfectly as well. After a while, the old woman started to feel really hungry. She rooted through some more garbage cans and found a potato, some carrots, and a rotting head of lettuce. Stuffing them into her mouth, she gobbled them all down. The more she ate, the hungrier she got. Then, the woman spotted a stray cat. She chased the cat for a few blocks, and when she finally caught it, the cat started screeching and scratching and spitting. She didn't care. She just jammed it into her mouth, chewed it up, and devoured it, tail and all. A policeman was walking his beat when he saw the wrinkled old woman gnawing on a lamp post. He walked up to her and asked her what she was up to. The old woman stopped nibbling on the lamp post and turned to face him. She had the biggest set of teeth that he had ever seen. All of a sudden, she pounced on him and started gnashing her teeth. Clack, clack, clack. He tried to fight her off, but she was too strong. She bit into his sleeve, tore off a piece of cloth, and guzzled it down. The officer pulled out his gun, but before he could get off a shot, she swallowed it whole. Then she ate the policeman as well, and when she was finished, all that was left was his badge and his handcuffs. A little while later, a kid on a bicycle came riding by. The woman chased after him with almost inhuman speed, grabbed him off his bike, and chomped on him until he was all gone. She then ate his bicycle for dessert, but her hunger still wasn't satisfied. Two homeless men were sleeping in a doorway, and she ate them before they even had a chance to wake up. Then, a man in a car stopped at a red light. The old woman smashed his window, pulled him out, and gobbled him down as well. The old woman ran through the streets, but they were now deserted. By this point, it was late at night, and no one else was around. She was getting desperate, and she was so hungry her mouth was watering. The drool was pouring down her front, and all she could think about was eating. Here we see her. She's halfway up her arm. She tried to stop, but she was just too tasty. Those false teeth continued to click and clack, chomping and chewing, slicing through flesh and bone like it was just candy. Soon, there was nothing left of the old woman but a puddle of blood and a pair of false teeth. Shortly before dawn, an old homeless man came shambling down the sidewalk and saw the false teeth lying in a puddle of blood. He didn't have any teeth of his own, so he picked them up, wiped them off, and shoved them in his mouth. They fit perfectly. The man walked off, beginning to think about how hungry he was. There was a woman named Sue who lived in an old house on a cliff overlooking the sea. She was divorced from her husband. Sue had been deeply depressed ever since her son, Robert, had drowned. She was devastated by the loss and felt like she couldn't go on. As time went by, Sue began reading books about black magic and Satanism. The more that she read, the more she became immersed in the world of the occult. It was like an addiction. She came across a spell that was supposed to be able to resurrect the dead. One dark night, she drew a pentagram on the floor of her living room. Lighting some black candles, she stood in the middle of the pentagram, and at the stroke of midnight, she read aloud from an ancient satanic book. "Come fulfill my desire and do my bidding in accordance with my will. I conjure thee in the name of Satan, to whom all evil is obedient, by which name the earth is overthrown, the seas turn black, the ground shudders, fire is quenched, and all host of things in heaven and hell do tremble. Lucifer, Prince of Darkness, return my son who drowned by accident. Return him to me now, I command thee." Afterwards, Sue blew out the candles. She collapsed to her knees and began to weep. All of a sudden, she heard a faint scratching on her front door. Cautiously, she walked over to the door and listened. The scratching grew louder. "Who's there?" she cried. There was a long silence, and then she heard a voice whisper, "Mommy?" Sue opened the door and was shocked to see a small boy crouched on the doorstep. He was soaking wet and shivering with the cold. "Robert!" she cried. "It's you! It's really you!" She hurriedly brought him inside and put a towel around him, trying to warm him up. His teeth were chattering and his hands were shaking. "I was so lonely and desolate without you, Robert," she said. "Where were you? What happened?" "I remember water," he said. "Cold water. And I couldn't breathe. I woke up and I couldn't remember who I was. I walked and walked in the rain. These people found me and they took me in. I didn't know if I was alive or dead." "You're alive, You're alive, Robert," she cried. "You're really alive." "Was I a good boy, Mommy?" Robert asked. "Of course you were a good boy," she replied. "Did you love me, Mommy?" Robert asked. "I do love you," she replied, "from the bottom of my heart." "Were you nice to me, Mommy?" "Of course I was," she said. Robert stared at her. It was a mean, angry stare, and there was a spiteful sneer on his face. It frightened Sue. "I want to play a game with you, Mommy," he cried. "Hide and seek." All of a sudden, he raced up the stairs. All of the lights in the house went out. "Robert, what are you doing?" she cried. "Where are you?" There was no answer. "Robert, stop this!" she cried. "I want you to come back here right now, Robert. Please don't do this to Mommy. Robert, for the last time, what are you doing?" Just then, she heard the boy's voice coming from the darkness. "Aren't you glad that the lights are out, Mommy?" he said. "It makes this game more fun." "You're going to hurt yourself in the dark," Sue replied. Sue cautiously walked up the stairs, feeling her way in the darkness. When she got to the top, she looked around, straining her eyes to see. "Robert, stop this now!" she shouted. "You're making Mommy very angry." All of a sudden, the door burst open, and Robert was standing there, cackling like a maniac. In his hand, he held a long, sharp kitchen knife.
"Let's play hide-and-seek now, Mommy!"
he shrieked. Sue recoiled in horror, backing away. She tripped and went tumbling down the stairs. When she landed at the bottom, she looked up and saw her son coming down the stairs with the knife raised above his head.
"You lied, Mommy! Robert didn't really drown by accident. You knew that. Robert drowned himself. He couldn't stand the way you treated him, and he killed himself just to get away from you. Don't you see? Robert didn't want to come back, Mommy. No, Robert hates you, Mommy. He didn't want to come back, so he sent me instead."
Just then, there was a flash of lightning, and it lit up the house. For one terrible moment, Sue saw the face of the thing that had come back instead of Robert. There was a young girl named Radka who lived in a small city in the Czech Republic. Her father lost his job and was unable to find work. The family fell on hard times and were forced to sell their house. They had to move to Prague and rent an apartment in an old, decrepit building. Radka was sad to say goodbye to all of her friends in school and promised them that she would try to keep in contact with them. The young girl didn't like the hustle and bustle of the new city in which she was forced to live. The people seemed to be very unfriendly, and there were no kids her age living in the apartment building. As summer came to an end, she began to dread what life had in store for her. To allay her fears, her parents told her that everything would be fine once she started school. The young girl wasn't so sure. On her first day of school, Radka hoped that she would make some new friends. However, she found that her new classmates were very unpleasant. When she tried to talk with them, they just turned up their noses at her and walked away. When she tried to join in with their games, they refused to include her. As the days went on, the kids at school began to display an intense hatred for the poor girl. They taunted her relentlessly, making fun of her hair, her clothes, and her accent. They told her that her face looked like a rat and christened her Rat Girl. She tried to tell her parents that she was being bullied in school, but they were too busy worrying about the family's finances to pay much attention. The bullying gradually got worse and worse, and Radka had no idea what to do about it. Some of the kids would punch her and kick her and call her names. Others would beat her up and steal her lunch. Still more would play cruel tricks on her, tearing up her school books or writing on her locker. She spent most of her days at school desperately trying to avoid her classmates. One day, the teasing and bullying became so bad that she couldn't take it anymore. Her classmates dragged her out to a river near the school and threw her in. As she sat on the school toilet, trying to dry her clothes, the poor girl began thinking of a plan. By the end of the day, Radka had come up with an idea to get revenge on all of the kids in the school who were tormenting her. On the way home from school that evening, she found a dead rat by the side of the road. She picked it up and brought it home with her. When her parents went out after dinner, Radka took a meat grinder out of the kitchen cupboard and put the rat inside. She turned the handle and ground the dead rat up into minced meat. Then she cooked it in a frying pan. It smelled awful, so she added lots of herbs and spices. When her disgusting meal was finished, she placed it neatly in a plastic container and put it inside of her school bag. The next day at school, Radka waited until lunchtime to unveil her horrible plan. When the bell rang for lunch, she made her way to the school cafeteria and sat at one table, on her own. She took the fried rat meat out of her bag, placed it on the table in front of her, and waited. Soon enough, 2 girls came over and started teasing her and calling her names. They stole her lunch and passed it around the cafeteria. Everyone had a bite. All of her classmates were laughing at her and calling her, "Rat girl, rat girl." About 1 hour later, her schoolmates began feeling queasy. One by one, the kids got up from their desks and ran to the toilets. The teacher had no idea what was going on. Radka ran out to the school toilets to see the results of her handiwork. All of the stalls in the bathroom were occupied, and she could hear the sounds of retching, vomiting, and diarrhea. The air was filled with the smell of fecal matter and vomit. Some girls were holding their hands over their mouths, waiting desperately to get into a stall. Others couldn't wait and had to resort to defecating in the sinks. When there were no sinks free, one girl ran in and threw up all over a girl who was defecating in the sink. It was utter pandemonium. Radka smiled with satisfaction. By the next morning, her classmates had figured out her cunning plan. During class, she could see all of the girls staring at her and giving her dirty looks. She knew that it was just a matter of time before they took their revenge on her. During lunch break, 2 girls approached Radka. She was expecting them to beat her up, but instead, they apologized to her. "We're all really sorry about the way we treated you, Radka," they said. "We hope that we can make it up to you." The girls told her that her classmates were waiting for her in the classroom. They said they all wanted to apologize and welcome her into their group. Although Radka was suspicious, she was so eager for acceptance that she threw caution to the wind and followed the girls in. They led her down the corridors, but as they were passing the door to the school basement, the 2 girls suddenly turned and grabbed her. One of them held her tightly while the other opened the door. Radka tried to struggle, but it was no use. The girls pushed her through the doorway. Radka tumbled down the stairs and landed on the cold concrete below. She heard the sound of the door slamming and the key turning in the lock. The basement was in a disused part of the school. No matter how loud she screamed, nobody would ever hear her. Lying on the floor of the basement, her back aching, Radka began to cry bitterly. She started looking for another way out, but the windows were too high to reach. She was trapped like a rat in a cage. In frustration, the poor girl began kicking the wall. She kicked it again and again, and was kicking so hard that her foot went straight through the plaster. She got down on her knees and began tearing at the wall, making the hole bigger and bigger until it was large enough for her to fit through. Sticking her head through the hole and peering inside, Radka saw that there were no water pipes or electrical wires behind the wall. For some reason, there was a small gap between the inner wall and the outer wall. It was a very narrow passageway that led to the left and right, but it was just about wide enough for her to squeeze through. Radka felt that it was her only avenue of escape, so she crawled through the hole and made her way down the narrow passage. It was dark, and she was scared, but she forced herself to press on. Eventually, she noticed a thin beam of light shining through a tiny hole in the wall. She scratched at it with her fingernail, and it got a little bigger. Peeking through, she realized that she was right beside the school principal's office. She could see the principal sitting at his desk, unaware that he was being watched. He wasn't doing any work. He was just sitting there, staring into space. And then he began picking his nose, and he ate it. "Ew, gross," thought Radka as she chuckled to herself and moved on. She crawled further down the passage and came to another bright spot in the wall. She scratched at it to make the hole bigger and put her eye up to the hole. She discovered that it was the teacher's lounge. She could see her geography teacher and her history teacher. They were locked in a passionate embrace and were kissing each other. "Wow, they're having an affair," she thought to herself. Moving on, Radka found that the passage began to slope upwards. In some places, it was almost vertical, and she struggled to find a foothold. Eventually, she reached another tiny point of light. She looked through the little hole, and it took a while for her eyes to adjust to the light. When they did, she realized that she was staring directly into the teacher's bathroom. She could see her English teacher sitting on the toilet. Suddenly, she heard a loud splash. "Ugh, disgusting," she thought to herself. She kept going, confident that she would soon find a way out. As she went further down the passage, it began to get more and more narrow. After crawling for a while, she came to a corner that was at a slight angle. Radka tried to squeeze through the narrow space. Her head and upper body went through without a problem, but her hips and buttocks got stuck on the turn. She tried with all of her might to pull herself through, but it was no use. The corner was too small. However, when she tried to go backwards, she found that she couldn't budge an inch. Her bottom half had become stuck fast between the densely packed concrete blocks. In desperation, she even tried to rotate her body like a drill, but her efforts were in vain. Her worst fears had come true. "I can't believe it," said Radka. "I'm stuck." She began to panic and felt as if she couldn't breathe. She wondered if she would be trapped behind the walls forever. The young girl rested for a few minutes, trying to tell herself to remain calm while trying to gather her thoughts. She began to think about her mother and father and the fact that she might not ever see them again. Her eyes welled up with tears. "Help! Help! Help!" she screamed again and again, but nobody answered her cries. Just then, Radka felt something brush against her leg. There was a strange, musty smell in the air. She put her hand down and felt the touch of soft, warm fur. And when her fingers closed around the long, fleshy tail, she screamed. "Rats!" All at once, at least 3 or 4 rats began swarming on Radka. They climbed up her legs and scrambled over her head, their sharp claws digging into her skin. She began to panic, and she felt something bite into her ear. Radka started slapping at the scurrying rats with her hands, desperately trying to make them retreat. One rat began nibbling at her toe, and she kicked it away. Her frightened screams rang out along the passageway, but nobody was there to hear them. She lay there for what seemed like hours, stuck in the passageway, fending off a group of ravenous rodents. Every time that she thought the rats had gone, they reappeared and attacked her again. Her head was pounding and her body ached. All of her hope for salvation was gone. Going crazy with the amount of pain that she was in, Radka reached out and grabbed hold of one of the rats. In a rage, she strangled it with one hand and put the rat's dead body under her head to use as a pillow. The other rats scurried back to their hiding places. They seemed to finally be scared. Radka lingered in the hole for 3 days, halfway between life and death. Sometimes she managed to get a few minutes of sleep. Whenever the rats came too close, she would kill one of them with her bare hands and toss the carcass at its comrades. She had to go to the toilet and was forced to do her business right there on the spot. Lying in her own feces and urine, Radka gave up all hope. "Oh, please just hurry up and let me die," she thought miserably. A horrible smell permeated the narrow passage. Radka was extremely hungry and dying of thirst. All she wanted was something to drink. One rat strayed too close to her, and when she got it into her clutches, she brought it up to her mouth and bit into its neck. She began to drink the rat's blood, but the blood of one rat was not enough. She needed more. After 1 month, Radka was still stuck behind the walls. She managed to survive by catching rats, drinking their blood, and eating their dead bodies. She was terribly bored, and her only entertainment was to listen to the rats squeaking. It got to the point when she almost felt she could understand what they were saying to each other. One day, when Radka awoke, she tried to squeeze herself around the corner again. She had become so thin that she managed to dislodge herself and became unstuck. She crawled further down the passageway until she came to a welcome spot of light. She punched a hole in the wall, and a bright light shone through, burning her eyes. She dragged herself through the hole and, like a snake, slithered into the room. Radka's teacher was standing at the front of the classroom, and the classmates were sitting at their desks. All of a sudden, they heard a pounding noise, and the wall at the back of the classroom burst open. Bricks and plaster were scattered all over the floor. As the students watched, open-mouthed, a pair of fists emerged from the hole, and something dirty and smelly emerged from the depths. The stench reeked like 100 toilets. The thing scurried across the floor, and they realized that it was a young girl, her face covered in dried blood, and her clothes soaked in urine and excrement. Everyone began to scream in terror. Just then, an army of rats came streaming out of the hole and began to attack all of the other children.
"Kill them all!"
screamed Radka as she pounced on one girl and grabbed a hold of her arm. Insane with hunger, she sank her teeth into the girl's hand and drank her blood. The girl screamed in horror and pain. The teacher rushed over and tried to rescue the girl, but Radka pounced on the teacher too and began gnawing on her legs. The children were all screaming and crying as the rats swarmed all over them. The vicious rodents scurried back and forth, scratching, biting, and feeding on their terrified victims. No one was spared. Their sharp teeth chomped down on whatever they found, be it hands, legs, or necks. It was utter pandemonium. Quite some time later, when the police finally arrived, it was all over. They found the classroom's walls, floors, and ceiling covered in blood. The skeletal remains of many children lay scattered around the room. In the middle of all of this chaos, there was a young girl sitting on the floor, gnawing at pieces of the teacher's corpse. I was working as a personal injury lawyer when Melissa came into my life. I fell in love with her the moment that I met her. She was a very beautiful woman. I knew she was the perfect woman for me, and someday we would be married. On our wedding day, we took our vows at the altar. She swore she would never leave me. She would stay with me through thick and thin. I promised Melissa I would always take care of her. I would never let anything bad happen to her, and I would always be there to protect her. When we came back from our honeymoon, we moved into a little bungalow outside of town. I set up a law office, and Melissa took care of the house. Our married life was bliss, and we settled into a comfortable routine. Every day, after I finished work, I would call Melissa and tell her what time I'd be home for dinner. However, that all changed one evening when I called Melissa and she didn't answer the phone. To me, that was the first indication I got that something was seriously wrong. When I arrived at home, I was shocked to see the front door standing open. At that moment, I knew that Melissa was in trouble. She needed me to protect her. I grabbed a hammer from under the car seat and I rushed inside. "Melissa, I'm home," I shouted. "Where are you, Melissa?" She didn't answer. There was an ominous silence. The kitchen was empty and the dinner was burning on the stove. I turned it off and I looked around. Everything was in disarray. There were broken plates and smashed bowls strewn about everywhere all over the floor. Gripping tightly to the hammer in my hand for protection, I searched the house, calling out my wife's name. I finally found her in the bedroom, lying on the floor. Her clothes were torn, her face was bruised and bloody, but she was still alive. "Melissa!" I cried. "What happened?" "I don't know," she groaned. "A man broke in. He demanded money. When I told him I didn't have any, he just started hitting me. He wouldn't stop hitting me. I couldn't fight him off. It hurt so much." "Don't worry, I'm here now," I said, trying to soothe her. "Everything's going to be okay." I picked up my injured wife, and holding her in my arms, I carried her out to the car. Opening the door, I laid her down as gently as possible in the back seat. Then I hopped into the driver's seat, and we drove off towards town. "We've got to go to the police," she said. We will, honey," I replied. "But first, I'm going to take you to the hospital." Behind me, I heard Melissa let out a little gasp. Her injuries were quite serious. I cursed myself and cursed the fact that I hadn't been home that day to protect her. I had to get her to a doctor as soon as possible. We drove through town, but on the way, we got stuck in a traffic jam. I started honking my horn and trying to navigate, trying to get people to clear out of the way. Suddenly I heard Melissa cry out, "There he is!" "Who?" I asked, startled. "The man who attacked me! That's him! That's him!" On the left-hand side of the street, there was a man getting out of his car. Melissa was pointing at him. "Are you sure?" I asked. She became hysterical. Tears were pouring down her cheeks and she was having trouble catching her breath. "That's him! That's him!" I pulled over to the side of the road and parked my car. My brain was boiling over with rage. Before I'd gotten out of the car, I reached over and grabbed the hammer. The man was casually walking down the street without a care in the world, and I followed him. Just as I got close, I saw him turn down a dark alley. I don't know what came over me. I just planned to rough him up a little and then hand him over to the police. But somehow, I lost control of myself. I couldn't stop. It was over in a few seconds. When I came back to the car, Melissa seemed to have calmed down. We didn't say a word to each other, yet we both knew what I had done. I grabbed a tissue and I wiped the blood from my hands, and then I hid the bloody hammer under the seat, and we drove off towards the hospital. When we got to the hospital, I helped Melissa out of the car and carried her to the emergency room. As we walked through the front doors, she suddenly stopped in her tracks and grabbed my arm tightly. She was trembling with fear, and she reached up her hand and pointed at one of the doctors. "That's him," she whispered urgently. "That's him." And then she pointed at one of the nurses. "That's him," she screamed. "That's him." Just for fun, we're adding a special short section here. These are horror stories that consist of only 5 words. Some authors see this as an exercise to use the minimal amount of words and imagery in order to try to convey a scary scene. Just saw my reflection blink. Living alone, toilet seats warm. Alone in bed, blanket shifted. You didn't kill that spider. My shadow walked past me. It enjoys watching you sleep. Went swimming. Something touched me. Last person living hears screaming. That door was just closed. Everyone you know will die. The clown called your name. The devil wants your soul. Calls came from inside house. Why is one knife missing? If they wake up, run. You awake suddenly, buried alive. Daughter screams at her funeral. Her heart stopped. She didn't. Thank you for tuning in once again. We hope that you've enjoyed Terrifying Tales Volume 3. Don't forget to like the videos and subscribe to the channel. And please, if you are enjoying the atmosphere and the stories that we've been telling you, share this to your social media. Spread the word. Help us to get more subscribers and more views. We appreciate you being here, and we hope that you have sweet dreams.